When I bought my dream ranch in the countryside, I thought I had finally escaped the headaches of city bureaucracy and petty neighborhood politics. My property sat on over 50 acres of land, surrounded by rolling hills, dense forests, and a peaceful creek. It was the perfect place to live in peace, raise my livestock, and enjoy life on my terms, without Noah breathing down my neck. Or so I thought. The first sign of trouble appeared about a month after I moved in, when I noticed a large manila envelope zip-tied to my front gate. Confused, I walked up to it and found a neatly printed welcome packet from a nearby homeowners association, congratulating me on my new residence in the community and outlining a ridiculous set of rules and regulations that I was supposedly required to follow. Flipping through the packet, I saw rules on fencing height, acceptable barn colors, limitations on livestock per acre, and even a regulation stating that no unapproved structures could be built without HOA permission. The absurdity of it made me laugh at first, until I got to the final page, which included a new resident compliance checklist and a notice of an upcoming inspection of my property. It also included a list of fines that would be imposed if I failed to bring my property into compliance. That's when the laughter stopped. I had never signed any HOA agreement when purchasing my property. I knew for a fact that my ranch was outside of their subdivision, and yet here they were, acting as if they owned my land. Annoyed, I tossed the packet into my truck and drove into town to speak with a lawyer. After reviewing my deed and the county zoning maps, my attorney confirmed what I already knew. My land was not under HOA jurisdiction. In fact, my property wasn't even in their district boundaries. Armed with this information, I did what any reasonable person would do. I ignored the letter, assuming it was just an overzealous HOA trying their luck. That was my first mistake. 2 days later, I woke up to find another letter taped to my gate. This one wasn't as friendly. It stated that I had failed to acknowledge HOA regulations and that my property was in violation of community standards. It threatened daily fines if I didn't respond immediately and schedule a compliance review. The letter also contained a formal warning that my ranch's fencing was not in accordance with HOA guidelines and that I was subject to modification requirements. At this point, I was beyond irritated. It was clear they were not going to take silence as an answer. I drove down to their office to confront them in person, walking into their fancy, overly polished HOA headquarters, a building that stood in stark contrast to the rural ranches surrounding the town. The receptionist, a plastic-smiled woman in her mid-50s, barely looked up before handing me a clipboard with a form to submit a compliance plan. I didn't take the clipboard. Instead, I said, "I don't think you understand. I'm not part of your HOA. I never signed anything. My land isn't even within your boundaries." Her smile stiffened, and she motioned for someone behind the counter. Within seconds, a well-dressed man in a navy blue suit appeared. He introduced himself as Greg Saunders, the HOA vice president, and invited me into his office. That's when I realized this was going to be a fight. Greg sat down and immediately started talking as if I was already under his authority. He slid a stack of paperwork across the desk, highlighting some vague clause about how the HOA had the right to expand governance over properties that fell within a certain radius of the community. When I pointed out that my deed, my lawyer, and the county zoning office all said otherwise, Greg just smiled smugly and said, "I think you'll find that resisting HOA compliance is a costly mistake." I stood up. "Not as costly as trying to enforce rules on land you don't own. Stay off my property." With that, I walked out. But if I thought that was the end of it, I was dead wrong. Because the HOA, they weren't going to take no for an answer. And things were about to get a whole lot worse. I had hoped that my face-to-face confrontation with the HOA would put an end to their nonsense, but I should have known they weren't going to back down that easily. Instead of leaving me alone, they doubled down, shifting from passive-aggressive letters to full-blown harassment. It started with more notices, dozens of them, arriving in my mailbox almost daily, each one more ridiculous than the last. At first, they just repeated the same nonsense about my property being out of compliance. But within a week, the letters became increasingly aggressive, listing new violations they had magically discovered. According to the HOA, my barn was the wrong color, my fence was too tall, my livestock was excessive for the community standard, and my personal favorite, I was generating excessive dust on my driveway. Excessive dust. On a dirt road. In the middle of a ranch. It was clear at this point that they weren't just trying to enforce rules, they were actively trying to make my life miserable. But the real kicker. The letters weren't coming from the Postal Service. No, these letters were being hand-delivered and taped to my fence, my front gate, and even my barn door. Someone from the HOA was physically entering my property to leave these notices, and that's when I realized they were trespassing. I decided to set up trail cameras along my property, something I already used for wildlife tracking, so I could catch these clowns in the act. And it didn't take long before I got exactly what I needed. 2 days later, at 6:14 a.m., my cameras captured clear footage of two HOA board members creeping onto my land. One of them was a middle-aged man in khakis and a polo, clipboard in hand, while the other was a woman dressed like she was about to sell a house. They walked along my fence line, taking pictures, making notes, and most importantly, stapling violations to my property. I wasn't just dealing with a pushy HOA. I was dealing with a full-blown harassment campaign. Furious, I took the printed photos straight to the local police department, demanding to file a trespassing report. But much like my first visit to the sheriff's office, the officer behind the desk seemed hesitant to get involved. HOA disputes are usually civil matters, he said, flipping through the photos. You sure they don't have some legal claim to your property? I nearly laughed. My lawyer already confirmed they don't. I have the deed. I have zoning records. My land is private property, and I never signed any HOA agreements. The officer sighed, rubbing his temples. All right, I'll file a report, but if they didn't break anything or steal anything, it's just a minor trespassing offense. Great, I said. Then the next time they show up, I'll be pressing full charges. But as frustrating as the police's reluctance was, the real escalation happened a few days later. One afternoon, I was checking my cattle when I saw something out of the ordinary. A white SUV with tinted windows and no official markings was parked just off my property line. At first, I figured it was just a lost traveler, but then I noticed the two people inside, both wearing matching blue polo shirts with a compliance embroidered on the chest. One of them was holding a camera with a massive zoom lens, taking pictures of my property. I walked toward the fence and yelled out to them, "Can I help you?" The driver, a balding man with sunglasses, didn't even flinch. He just kept taking photos while the passenger, a woman with a clipboard, finally responded. "We're conducting a compliance review of your property," she called back, as if she were a government official. I laughed. "I don't think so. This isn't HOA land. You don't have any jurisdiction here." She gave me a fake smile and responded, "All properties within a 5-mile radius of the community are subject to our oversight." That was complete and utter nonsense. I took a few steps closer. "Well, this is private land. You're trespassing, so I suggest you leave before I call the sheriff." The man finally lowered his camera and turned to his colleague. "Let's go," he muttered. They pulled away, but I knew this wasn't over. Sure enough, that evening, I found a fresh violation notice taped to my front gate. This one accused me of refusing an HOA compliance inspection and warned that I was subject to enforcement actions. Enforcement actions? I didn't know what they meant by that, but I was about to find out. Because the next time the HOA showed up, they weren't just spying from the road. They were on my land. And this time they brought something new. A vehicle labeled HOA Patrol. I'd already caught the HOA snooping around my land, leaving violation notices, and trying to claim authority over my property. But what happened next took things to an entirely new level. I woke up one morning, poured myself a cup of coffee, and was about to start my daily chores when I noticed something strange through my kitchen window. A white SUV with HOA Patrol magnets on the doors, parked just inside my property line. At first, I thought maybe they were turning around or had accidentally pulled onto my land. But then I noticed two men in matching HOA polos stepping out of the vehicle, clipboards in hand. One of them was holding a measuring tape, and the other was taking photos of my barn. They were inspecting my property, like they had any right to be there. My blood boiled. I grabbed my phone and stormed out the front door, slamming it behind me. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" The two men barely even looked up at first, still taking notes and whispering to each other. Then, the one with the measuring tape turned toward me and put on his best fake customer service smile. "Good morning. We're with the HOA Compliance Department. We're conducting an enforcement inspection to ensure your property is in line with community regulations." I almost laughed in his face. "Community regulations?" I repeated, stepping closer. "I'm not in your damn community. This is private property." The second guy, the one with the clipboard, gave me a condescending nod. "Sir, All properties within the HOA's designated expansion zone are subject to oversight. This is a routine inspection, and we expect full cooperation. I clenched my jaw. Designated expansion zone? That's not a real thing. My property isn't part of your HOA. We have legal authority, the first guy said smugly, as if that settled the matter. And refusal to comply may result in enforcement actions. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. These guys were so confident in their fake authority that they had actually shown up with a fake patrol unit and were talking to me like they were the police. I stepped forward, getting right in their faces. You have about 10 seconds to get back in that SUV and leave before I charge you with trespassing. The clipboard guy chuckled. Sir, you don't understand. We have the right to be here. I pulled out my phone and held it up. You're about to have the right to explain all this to the sheriff? That finally wiped the smirks off their faces. Clipboard guy held up a hand. Whoa, there's no need to escalate this. We're just following procedures. The only procedure you need to follow is getting the hell off my land. I cut him off. No. They hesitated, exchanging nervous glances. Then, finally, they backed off and headed toward their SUV. As they climbed in, I snapped several photos of their vehicle, their faces, and the fake patrol magnet on the doors. I wanted as much evidence as possible. Before driving off, the driver rolled down his window. You should be careful about resisting community standards, he warned. Ignoring the eight never ends well. I took a step closer to the window and leaned down. Neither does trespassing, I said coldly. Come back here again, and you'll find out the hard way. Then I turned my phone toward him, still recording. Go ahead and repeat what you just said about resisting the HOA. I'd love to have that on record. The guy shut his mouth real fast and rolled up the window. They sped off, kicking up dust as they drove away. But I wasn't stupid. I knew they'd be back. That night, I downloaded the footage from my security cameras, saved the pictures I took, and made 3 copies of everything. Then I made a call to the sheriff's office. Because if the HOA thought they could keep playing this game, they were about to learn the hard way that I wasn't going to lose. After the HOA Patrol clowns trespassed on my land and had the nerve to threaten me with enforcement actions, I knew it was time to end this nonsense once and for all. That night, I reviewed my security footage, organized every violation notice, and compiled a thick folder of evidence. Photos, videos, printed copies of the fraudulent HOA letters, and even legal documents proving my ranch was not within their jurisdiction. Then I made a call. The next morning, I drove straight to the local sheriff's department and demanded to file a formal complaint for trespassing, harassment, and fraud. At first, the deputy at the front desk gave me the same old line I had heard before. HOA disputes are civil matters. I slapped the thick folder of evidence onto the counter. This isn't a dispute. It's criminal trespassing. They unlawfully entered my land, they threatened me, and they're impersonating law enforcement. That got his attention. A few minutes later, I was sitting across from Sheriff Dan Pearson, a gruff, no-nonsense guy in his late 50s, with a permanent scowl that told me he had zero patience for nonsense. He opened the folder and began flipping through the violations, photos, and legal documents. After a few minutes, he sighed and looked up. So let me get this straight. These HOA people have been harassing you for weeks, claiming you're under their authority, even though your property isn't part of their district. That's correct. And now they've sent an unmarked vehicle with HOA Patrol magnets to your ranch, entered your land without permission, and issued fake citations? Exactly. The sheriff exhaled and leaned back in his chair. Sounds like someone needs a legal wake-up call. That's what I had been waiting to hear. I handed him a USB drive containing my security footage from the previous day, the one where the HOA Patrol goons ignored my warnings, measured my barn, took pictures of my fence, and blatantly admitted they were conducting an enforcement inspection. Sheriff Pearson plugged it into his computer, watched the footage for a full minute, then chuckled. These guys really think they're the law, huh? That's exactly the problem, I said. They're acting like they have actual police powers, and when I told them to leave, they refused. The sheriff cracked his knuckles. All right, let's go have a chat with these folks. The confrontation begins. A little over an hour later, I followed 2 sheriff's deputies in my truck as they drove toward the HOA's fancy little headquarters in town. It was a pristine, well-manicured building, completely out of place in a community that was mostly farmland, open fields, and old country roads. The moment we pulled into the parking lot, I could already see board members peering through the windows, nervously whispering to each other. Sheriff Pearson and his deputies strode through the front doors like they owned the place. I followed behind, arms crossed, waiting to see how the HOA would try to squirm their way out of this one. The same receptionist from my first visit looked up and immediately went pale. "See, can I help you, officers?" she stammered. "Yeah," Sheriff Pearson said, pulling out his badge. "We need to have a conversation with your board members." "No." Before she could respond, Greg Saunders, the smug HOA vice president, stepped out from a nearby office. "Sheriff, what's the meaning of this?" Greg asked, faking his best concerned citizen voice. The sheriff didn't waste time. He flipped open a notepad and started listing off charges. "We have complaints of criminal trespassing, harassment, fraudulent citations, and illegal impersonation of law enforcement. We have multiple eyewitness statements, security footage, and documentation proving your organization has been unlawfully targeting properties outside your jurisdiction." Greg's smug expression faltered. "Now, hold on just a minute. We have every right to enforce community standards. Not outside your HOA borders, you don't," I interrupted, stepping forward. "And definitely not on my land." Greg shot me a venomous glare, then turned back to the sheriff. "This is all a misunderstanding. The HOA has the authority to regulate properties that fall under community influence." "There's no such thing as community influence, Greg," I snapped. "You made that up. My property is legally exempt from HOA governance. You have no authority over me." The sheriff nodded. "We confirmed with the county office, this man's ranch is not part of your HOA district, which means you and your patrol officers unlawfully entered private property and issued fake citations." At that, Greg's face turned bright red. He was losing control of the situation, and he knew it. "We were just trying to ensure community compliance," he tried again, "to protect property values." "Property values?" I scoffed. "You sent fake patrol officers onto my land, you took pictures of my home like you were collecting evidence for a lawsuit, and you threatened me with enforcement actions. That's not protecting property values. That's harassment." Greg swallowed hard. Then the sheriff delivered the final blow. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, voice firm. "You're going to cease all harassment against this man and every other homeowner outside your HOA boundaries. You're going to disband this ridiculous HOA Patrol immediately. And if I hear so much as a whisper of another incident like this, we will be pressing full criminal charges." Greg clenched his jaw, his face twitching with barely concealed rage. Then the receptionist suddenly spoke up. What about the citations we've already issued?" The sheriff turned to me. "You got all those fake violation letters?" I grinned and held up the folder. "Every single one." The sheriff turned back to Greg. "Yeah, you're going to be tearing those up. All of them." Greg gritted his teeth, but he nodded. "Fine." But I wasn't done yet. "Oh, and one more thing," I said, stepping closer. "You owe me a formal written apology. And if I ever see an HOA representative within 100 yards of my property again, I'll press charges so fast your head will spin." Greg looked like he wanted to punch a hole in the wall. But he nodded again. The HOA had lost. And I had just won the first battle. But this war wasn't over yet, because I wasn't just going to walk away quietly. I was going to take them down for good. The HOA Patrol had been shut down, their fake citations were torn up, and their board members had just received a very public dressing down from the sheriff. But I wasn't satisfied with just scaring them off my land. No, I wanted to make sure they never pulled this stunt on anyone else again. So I did what any reasonable rancher would do. I sued the hell out of them. That afternoon, after leaving the HOA headquarters, I drove straight to my lawyer's office. Mark Calloway, my attorney, was already familiar with my ongoing battle with the HOA, but when I walked in and handed him the newest stack of fake violation letters, security footage, and the official trespassing report from the sheriff, his eyebrows shot up. "Well, damn," he muttered, flipping through the paperwork. "They really don't know when to quit, do they?" "Apparently not," I said, "which is why I want to take them to court. I'm done playing nice." Mark nodded. "Good. Because now we have enough to bury them." Within 48 hours, Mark filed an official lawsuit against the HOA for criminal trespassing, harassment, fraudulent fines and violations, unlawful surveillance, and invasion of privacy. impersonation of law enforcement for their fake HOA patrol. And just for good measure, we also requested a full financial audit of the HOA's funds. Why? Because something wasn't adding up. HOAs usually funded their operations through member dues, but considering how much money they had dumped into their fake patrol cars, legal intimidation, and fraudulent enforcement, I had a strong suspicion that they were using shady tactics to keep themselves afloat. The HOA's panic begins. The moment the lawsuit was filed, the entire HOA board went into full-blown damage control. I started getting emails and letters from their lawyers, all claiming this was a big misunderstanding and that they never intended to cause me stress. Oh, sure. I ignored every single one. Then came the phone calls. One evening, while I was feeding my cattle, my phone buzzed. I checked the caller ID. Greg Saunders, HOA Vice President. I grinned. Oh, this was going to be fun. I answered. Hope you're calling to apologize. Listen, Greg started, his voice dripping with forced politeness. We really don't need to take this to court. I think if we just sit down and talk, we can come to a mutual understanding. I smirked. Oh, we already have an understanding, Greg. You understand that you messed up. And I understand that I'm about to win a very expensive lawsuit. Silence. Then Greg tried again. Look, we'll drop all the citations, and we'll even issue a formal apology. You don't have to go through with this. I leaned against the fence, watching the sunset over my land. You still don't get it, do you? I said. It's not about the citations. It's about you thinking you can bully people into submission. And I want to make sure you never get to do it again. More silence. Then finally Greg snapped. Fine. You want to go to court? You'll regret this. The HOA has deep pockets. We can drag this out for years. I laughed. That's cute. I own a ranch, Greg. You think I don't know how to outlast a drought? And with that, I hung up. The legal firestorm. Once the court proceedings started, things quickly spiraled out of control for the HOA. First, during the discovery phase, my lawyer forced the HOA to turn over financial records. And guess what we found? Massive financial mismanagement. It turned out that Greg and his inner circle of board members had been illegally pocketing thousands of dollars from homeowners by inflating HOA fees, issuing fake fines, and creating bogus community improvement projects that never actually happened. For example, remember the HOA Patrol? Turns out, the vehicles and uniforms weren't purchased with HOA funds. They were leased through a company owned by Greg's brother. In other words, Greg had been funneling HOA money into his own family business. And the best part, once this information got out, homeowners in the actual HOA neighborhood started revolting. They demanded a full recall of the entire board. They refused to pay another cent in HOA fees until they got answers. And when local media picked up the story, the HOA board collapsed almost overnight. The judge in my case ruled in my favor, awarding me a huge settlement for damages, legal fees, and emotional distress. But the real victory, the HOA was dissolved entirely. Greg's final downfall. The final cherry on top came a few months later when I was driving through town and noticed a familiar face sitting outside a coffee shop, looking miserable. It was Greg. I pulled up next to him, rolled down my window, and grinned. So, Greg, how's the whole HOA empire thing working out for you? Greg just scowled, staring at his coffee. Go to hell. I chuckled. Oh, I already went through hell thanks to you. But I made it out. And now, I gestured toward the empty HOA office building across the street. Now I own the land where your precious used to stand. Greg's face turned pale. That's right. After the HOA went under, their former headquarters was put up for sale. And I bought it. Just for the satisfaction of knowing that the very place where they once tried to control me now belonged to me. Greg stood up, fuming. You think you won? I leaned back, tipping my hat. I don't think, Greg. I know. Then, with a grin, I drove off. Because I had finally won. And the HOA was nothing more than a bad memory. Even after winning the lawsuit, getting the HOA dissolved, and watching Greg and his goons crash and burn, I knew there was one more thing I needed to do. Make sure no other homeowner would ever have to deal with this level of HOA corruption again. Because while I had been strong enough to fight back, I realized that many people weren't as lucky. During the lawsuit, I had met countless homeowners from the actual HOA community who had been bullied, threatened, and scammed by Greg's organization. Some were too afraid to speak up, worried about retaliation. Others had lost thousands of dollars to fake violations and unlawful fines. And worst of all, many of them had nowhere to turn because too many HOAs operate unchecked, acting as their own little kingdoms. I wasn't just going to walk away now that I had one. I was going to change the game forever. Step 1. Shutting down the HOA's legacy. After the lawsuit victory, I worked with my lawyer, Mark Calloway, to make sure the former HOA board members couldn't just start over somewhere else. We filed personal claims against Greg and the other corrupt board members to prevent them from ever serving on another HOA board again. We ensured that every homeowner who had been unlawfully fined was refunded their money. We flagged the HOA's fraudulent financial activities with the state attorney's office, leading to a formal investigation into their business practices. And then, I bought the HOA's former headquarters. I turned it into a local resource center for homeowners dealing with HOA abuse, offering free legal consultations and a network of attorneys willing to fight back against corrupt homeowner associations. The same building where the HOA had once bullied homeowners was now dedicated to protecting them. I had officially turned the tables. Step 2. Changing the law. With media attention on the case, I used my platform to push for new state legislation that would prevent HOAs from overstepping their boundaries again. The Homeowners Protection Act, which I helped draft, included a ban on HOAs trying to claim authority over non-member properties, stricter financial oversight, requiring all HOAs to submit annual financial reports to prevent fraud, a restriction on HOA fines, ensuring they had to be approved through a legal process before being enforced, a law against HOA security patrols impersonating law enforcement. The bill passed unanimously in the state legislature. And just like that, the days of HOAs acting like unchecked dictatorships were officially numbered. Step 3. My ranch, my rules. With the HOA gone, my land was finally my own again. No more harassment. No more fake violations. No more trespassing HOA patrols pretending they were cops. For the first time since this nightmare began, I could wake up, step outside, and enjoy my ranch without some clipboard-wielding idiot telling me how to run it. And as for Greg Saunders and the former HOA board members, they were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered empire. Greg, who had once strutted around town like he owned a place, had to sell his house to cover legal fees. His brother's fake business that had been funneling HOA money shut down by state regulators. The entire former HOA community had to restructure under a new, homeowner-friendly system, one that actually protected residents instead of exploiting them. One evening, I was sitting on my porch, watching the sunset over my land, when one of my new neighbors drove up the dirt road toward my ranch. I recognized him as one of the homeowners who had been fined repeatedly under Greg's rule. He got out of his truck, shook my hand, and said, "Thanks for standing up to those bastards. You didn't just save your ranch, you saved all of us." I smiled and tipped my hat. "Nobody tells me how to run my land," I said. "And now, they won't be telling anyone else either." And with that, I finally had my peace. The HOA? Dead and buried. Greg? A broke, disgraced mess. And my ranch? Exactly how it was meant to be mine, and mine alone. The end.